What's happening, YouTube? So I'm at home, and yesterday I got my twin out for the first time, and which has actually been close on 6 months. It actually has been 6 months since I've had my twin out. I did have some issues with it. The clutch screw that holds the clutch plate in was a reverse thread. So the motor was spinning the same way as the reverse thread undoes. So what was happening was I'd run the car, even after red Loctite and spring washers and all sorts of stuff. I'd run the car and the clutch would start coming loose. So I have spent quite a bit of time doing a rebuild on this, and OBR had a new crank sent out to me, and I stripped the motor down and I replaced the crank on it. So without further ado, let's have a look at what I've put together. As a few photographs with me just going over the steps that I took to rebuild the motor, and then a first run. So let's get on to that and see what happens. I think I'm there. So yeah, so I'm not going to babble any further. Let's get on to some twin action. So this is what Sean has sent out: a new gasket set, a pair of 1107s, and a brand new crank and seals. I said about stripping out the motor from the chassis. It was pretty straightforward, and I started with this pull start side of the motor. Here you can see the flywheel and where the coils bolt on. The little nut in the center is where the starter pole actually pulls on to turn the motor over. I had to scratch my head a little bit to get it off. It turns out the back end of the plug spanner is the right tool for the job. Pretty stoked. Then I had to make a plan to get the flywheel off, and I used an IRC shock spanner as the flywheel puller because the stock Zenoa one doesn't work. Here's the crank, and you can see the keyway cut into it, and the keyway side is where the flywheel bolts on. Next up, I took the pistons off, and you can see how new those pistons are. Motor's barely used. I took a few pictures of the CNC porting on the 27cc heads that the motor comes with, and I was pretty impressed. It looks pretty neat. And this CNC porting is what they do to all their full mod motors and upgrade kits. Next up, I took the pistons off, and you can see the pistons, the roller bearings, and the gudgeon pins. And then I split the motor. It splits into 3 pieces, and the center bit for me was the most intriguing. This is what actually holds the crank in place, and it had these weird split rubber seals in the center. So it had 2 for each side, and here you can see a pair of them in my hand, and they actually fitted into each half of the center bit of the crankcase. Now the motor is completely all in pieces, and I'm getting ready to replace the new crank. And I've got the 1211 silicone sealer to seal up the center bit, and the center bit actually bolts up horizontally rather than vertically like the rest of the motor does. So I bolted that all up. I got my torque wrench on there, and I torqued all the nuts, the bolts down to spec. Then I start getting the crank seals on, and I bolted the rest of the crankcase to the center of the motor. You can see it's all back together now. Then I ran into some issues. The new crank was a couple tenths of a millimeter wider on the small end than the old crank. So when I came to assembling the pistons on the small end, there was no movement. So I had to sand down the roller bearing retainer washers that retain the roller bearing in the small end of the crank. Here you can see where they fit on. I spent a couple hours sanding them down with oil and 600 grit paper. until I got some free movement on those pistons. And this is the movement I was looking out for. Prior to me sanding them down, there was zero movement. I was also quite careful to make sure that I put the pistons back in the order that they come off. I started reassembling the heads on the clutch side of the motor, and you have to be quite careful when putting the heads back on that you squeeze the rings in properly. You don't want to score the inside of the head up. Now you can see both of the heads are back on, and I start putting the flywheel back on, and here you can see the plug spanner, the back of the plug spanner tightening that nut. Here's the ALX clutch, and I put that on. It's a 70mm adjustable clutch. There you can see the bell housing and the bell. That goes on next. Then I was going to torque down the heads, and I torqued down the heads to spec. So luckily I've got my torque wrench handy. Then I put on the heat sink that goes into the top of the heads. And next up I stuck the carbs on, and I also torqued those down to spec. And I slapped the motor back into the chassis. And I actually hadn't got it out since I shipped the motor from South Africa, so I had to reassemble all the control arms and suspension back on. Here's a quick look at the 4925 Blackbone gears and ALX clutch. Now the car's all back together, and I was ready to go out and do a bit of testing. So I had to wait a couple of days for the weather to improve because the weather's been so shite. And so yeah, here is some action after the rebuild. Just want to check the temperature, see how it's going, but it's looking pretty promising, I tell you. Oh, it's looking very promising indeed. Thanks all for watching, and thanks all for subscribing. Hope it wasn't too long and boring. Remember to like if you like, and don't like if you don't like. And stay tuned. There's undoubtedly going to be some more action in the next couple of weeks to come. Enjoy. Cheerio.